A white police officer orders a police dog to attack a little black girl in the park, thinking there would be no consequences. But when the girl's father, a police captain, shows up demanding justice, everything changes. Sign up now so you do not miss the upcoming events. Where are you watching from? The soft morning sun spreads over the park, bathing everything in a golden light. Laughter and chatter fill the air, families relaxing on picnic blankets, joggers moving rhythmically along the trails, and children with bright smiles playing in the playground. A light breeze carries the scent of freshly cut grass, making the morning air cool and refreshing, painting the perfect picture of a peaceful morning. But for John Miller, a white police officer, all of this just makes him feel distant. Wearing his neat police uniform, John does not blend into the scene. He walks along the trail with his loyal police dog Rex. Deep in thought, what fills his heart is not relief, but a smoldering irritation. Everyone here seems carefree, not worrying about the order or rules John has to enforce every day. They do not realize how much effort it takes to keep everything under control, and that frustrates him as he patrols. John's eyes accidentally fall on Alyssa, a black girl about 6 years old, joyfully running across the grass, chasing her toy plane. Alyssa's innocent laughter rings through the quiet space, and it only adds to John's discomfort. In his eyes she seems too carefree, too free, stirring an uneasy feeling inside him. This girl does not belong here, John thought, watching Alyssa's every step. The unease inside him began to transform into a quiet anger. Alyssa was just an innocent child, playing like any other kid. But in John's mind, her presence triggered unconscious biases. The girl with her black skin and innocent joy seemed to stand in stark contrast to what John thought should be in the park. That morning, Rex, the sleek-coated police dog, began to sense his owner's change in mood. Its ears perked up, sharp eyes locking onto Alyssa, as if waiting for a command. The leash in John's hand tightened slightly, and a dangerous thought began to form in his mind, one he did not question or hesitate over. John looked at Alyssa, gripping the leash tightly, and in that moment everything peaceful around him seemed to fade from his mind. In his head, one overwhelming thought dominated. This girl does not belong here. Rex let out a low growl, ready to act on command. This girl does not belong here. That thought repeated in John's mind, like a silent order driving his actions. His grip tightened on Rex's leash, and for a moment, everything went quiet, leaving only the sound of his own breath. In the intense gaze of the dog, the discomfort in John's heart flared into a decision he did not hesitate to make. Alyssa needed to be controlled. That black girl with her carefree attitude made John feel like he was losing control, and to him that was unacceptable. Alyssa has no idea what's about to happen. John thought. The girl kept playing, laughing, as her toy planes soared back and forth over the grass. Unaware of the approaching danger, Alyssa tripped on a small rock and fell, but immediately got back up, continuing to run her eyes, never leaving her plane. John clenched his teeth. "Let's go, Rex." His voice was low, cold. His command was just enough to trigger the instincts of the police dog. Rex tensed, its eyes locked on Alyssa with growing aggression, just waiting for the order. Rex was ready to charge like lightning. John loosened the leash in his hand, and Rex immediately lunged toward the girl. In an instant, the peaceful park erupted into chaos. Rex tore through the air at an incredible speed, its powerful legs slicing through the wind, sharp teeth bared, as its ferocious barking shattered the silence. Alyssa turned around at the sound of the growl, but it was too late. The smile on her innocent face vanished in an instant, replaced by pure terror. The massive dog closed in. Within seconds, her toy planes slipped from her hands. As Alyssa's eyes widened in fear, her legs frozen in place from the shock. She wanted to scream, but the scream got caught in her throat. In that moment, Rex reached her, knocking her to the ground. With a powerful leap, Alyssa fell, her small body pinned under the claws and teeth of the ferocious dog. The threatening growl rumbled from Rex's throat as it stood over Alyssa, its cold eyes locked on its target. Alyssa burst into tears, the droplets running down her cheeks as she cried out, "Help!" Her voice, hoarse from fear, rang weakly in the air that had once been filled with joy. From afar, people started to notice the situation, and screams began to echo from the crowd. Some ran closer, but were stopped by the dog's aggression. A woman sitting on a nearby bench gasped in horror, quickly pulling her child close. Joggers stopped, pulling out their phones to record what was happening in front of them. In the midst of all the chaos, John Miller stood at a distance, watching everything unfold with a cold, emotionless expression. He did not move to help Alyssa, nor did he order Rex to stop. Instead, he just stood there, his icy eyes fixed on the scene before him. In his mind, this was just a small lesson for the girl, to show her that not everyone could act freely and carelessly in a space he was responsible for. Amid the crying and terrifying growls of Rex, Alyssa lay on the ground, her small body trembling with fear. The crowd continued to gather, but no one dared get close, fearing the vicious police dog. Just then, from a distance, a voice rang out with authority and fury, breaking through the chaotic atmosphere. "Rex, stop immediately!" David Williams, Alyssa's father, appeared like a storm, rushing to the scene with eyes full of anger and fear. As a police captain in the area, David had been jogging in the park when he heard Rex's barking and the heartbreaking cries of his daughter. His heart nearly stopped when he recognized Alyssa's voice. Now, as he approached, he could not believe his eyes. His daughter was lying on the ground, being attacked by a police dog, and none other than John Miller, one of his colleagues, was watching indifferently from a distance. David shouted with all his strength, his voice echoing across the park, "John, call Rex off right now, stop!" Despite his overwhelming anger, David kept a sliver of rationality. Knowing he had to act quickly to save Alyssa, John slowly turned his head towards David, a momentary look of confusion flashing in his eyes. He knew David Williams, not just as a father protecting his child, but as the captain of the local police department, a man with far more authority than he had. But instead of hastily commanding Rex to stop, John remained cold, though. His hand trembled slightly upon hearing David's voice. The girl was acting suspicious, John muttered, trying to justify himself, but his words only made the situation worse. David had no patience left. To hear more, he rushed toward Alyssa, yanking Rex off her with incredible strength. David grabbed the police dog by the collar, and with a sharp command, Rex finally backed down, stopping its barking. David quickly knelt beside his daughter, pulling Alyssa protectively into his arms. checking to see if she was seriously hurt. Alyssa, still shaking and with tears streaming down her face, saw her father and immediately clung to him, sobbing. "Daddy," she cried, her voice breaking from the fear she had just endured. David held his daughter tightly, feeling her small heart pounding wildly with panic. "Daddy's here, you're okay," David whispered, his voice gentle but filled with protective strength. David's entire body trembled with rage. Once he was sure Alyssa was safe in his arms, he slowly stood up, his eyes burning with fury as he turned toward John. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" David shouted, his voice now that of a furious father and an authoritative police captain who could not accept the abuse of power he had just witnessed. The crowd around them remained silent, but the outrage was beginning to spread, with many people recording the entire incident on their phones. John stood across from David, but now he could no longer maintain his earlier calm. His hands shook as he gripped Rex's leash, unsure of how to respond to David's anger. In that moment, John realized he had made a grave mistake, not just in unleashing the dog on an innocent child, but in doing so to the daughter of a man with far more power. David did not wait for John to offer an explanation. "You attacked my daughter without any justification," David shouted, his voice filled with fury. "She's only 6 years old. What should she possibly have done to warrant releasing a dog to attack her? This is a blatant abuse of power." John stammered, I was just following procedure. She was acting suspicious." His attempt at an explanation sounded incredibly weak. Amid David's fury and the crowd's rising anger, David stared at John, disbelief written all over his face. "Procedure," he repeated, his voice dripping with contempt. "Are you telling me that the procedure allows you to release a dog to attack a child?" Playing in a park, no one in the crowd spoke, but it was clear that they all sided with David. Murmurs began to spread, and a few people moved closer to continue filming the entire scene. John now felt completely isolated, as no one in the crowd supported him. David turned back to his daughter, gently stroking Alyssa's head to comfort her, but his gaze never left John. "You're not going to get away with this. I will make sure you're investigated and held accountable for what you've done today." The entire park fell into a suffocating silence as David took Alyssa's hand and walked away, but there was no mistaking the determination in his eyes. John Miller stood frozen, watching as David Williams and Alyssa walked away. Each step David took felt like another nail, driven into the growing anxiety in John's heart. He knew this was no longer a minor incident. David Williams was not just an angry father. He was also a powerful police captain, and his promise of a serious investigation was certain to come true. Trying to maintain some semblance of authority in a situation that had spiraled out of control, John took a few steps forward, attempting to further justify his actions. "I was just following procedure," he said, his voice trying to stay calm, but still trembling slightly. "That girl, she was acting suspicious." David suddenly stopped and turned sharply to face John. His eyes blazed with anger, and the authority of a police captain was more evident than ever. "Procedure," David repeated, his voice full of sarcasm. "Are you really standing here, trying to justify releasing a police dog to attack a 6-year-old child?" As following procedure, she was playing John. She did nothing wrong. The tension between the two men was suffocating. John stiffened, feeling the eyes of the crowd, and the phone still pointed at him. David took a few more steps forward, now face to face with John, his voice low but filled with authority. "You did not just make a mistake. You abused your power, and worse. You did it to my daughter." Each word David spoke cut through the facade of authority John was trying to maintain. John opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. The crowd had grown larger, and their eyes were filled with anger mixed with shock. Some parents looked at John with disgust, shielding their children from his presence, as if he were a threat. The murmurs grew louder. "This is outrageous," a man in the crowd said loudly. "I cannot believe he let a dog attack a kid." And up the pressure from the crowd began to weigh heavily on John. He felt as if all eyes were on him, judging his every move. Rex, now leashed, again stood still beside John, but sensed the tension. It whimpered softly, as if warning that this situation was no longer in control. David took a deep breath, as if to regain some calm after his sharp accusations. But his eyes never left John, cold and determined. "You will not get away with this," John, David said, his voice now lowered, but the resolve within it had not diminished. "I will file a formal complaint, and you will be held accountable by internal affairs. This will not be swept under the rug like other cases." John heard these words and felt a chill run down his spine. He knew the investigation David promised would not just be an empty threat. With David's position and power, this incident was sure to become a focal point, not only within the police department, but also in the media. David bent down to check on his daughter Alyssa, who had calmed down a bit in his arms, but her eyes were still red from crying. Seeing the pain in his daughter's eyes only strengthened David's resolve. "I'm not just fighting for my daughter," he continued, his sharp gaze still on John. "I'm fighting for every child who has been treated unjustly, simply because of their skin color. You will pay for this." John stood there completely lost. He had no more excuses. Deep down, he knew he had crossed a line. Not just the line of the law, but the line of morality. But now, with David's fiery gaze and the crowd's rising outrage, he did not know what else to do but stand still, drowning in shame and worry about the consequences to come. David turned away, this time not looking back. He took Alyssa's hand and gently led her away from the park. The crowd remained silent, leaving John in a hollow space full of pressure. The disdainful glares in the phone still pointed at him, felt like they were drowning him in a sea of judgment. John Miller remained standing in the park, feeling the weight of loneliness and fear pressing down on his shoulders as David Williams and Alyssa disappeared into the distance. He knew that the storm he had feared had truly begun. This incident was not just a work-related mistake. It was an act he knew would provoke strong backlash from both the police department and the public, especially since the victim was the daughter of a powerful police captain. This could not be silenced. Within hours of David leaving the park, the incident began to spread rapidly across the media. Videos of John releasing Rex to attack Alyssa were shared widely on social media. Headlines began to appear on local news outlets. Police officer releases dog on black girl in park, and police captain's daughter attacked by police dog. Investigation demanded. The footage of the terrifying scene sparked public outrage, leading to a wave of strong protest. The next morning, David officially filed a complaint with Internal Affairs, the first step in his fight for justice. For his daughter had begun. David's complaint not only focused on John's unjustified use of the dog, but also asserted that it was an abuse of power. With racial undertones, David emphasized that John had no legitimate reason to attack Alyssa, an innocent child simply playing in the park. Internal Affairs immediately launched an investigation. Knowing this incident could not be taken lightly, especially with the growing pressure from the public and the media, John, now pushed into a defensive position, was notified that he would be subject to an internal investigation. The anxieties that had haunted him since the incident were now becoming clearer. He knew this would not end easily. At the police station, a strange silence hung in the air. John felt everyone avoiding him. Even his closest colleagues looked at him with unfamiliar, distant eyes. David Williams was not just a respected captain, but also a powerful voice in the community. This meant that anyone who sided with John would face pressure from both the public and within the department. Rumors began to spread throughout the police station, and some of John's colleagues even questioned whether releasing the dog to attack was really proper procedure. Later that afternoon, John was called into a meeting with the head of Internal Affairs. The officer in charge of the investigation, Sarah Thompson, an experienced officer, looked at John with a serious expression. Unable to hide her disappointment, Miller, she began, her voice slow but firm. Do you realize how far this situation has gone? This is not just an internal matter anymore. The entire community is watching, and this could seriously impact your entire career. John tried to remain calm. I was just following procedure, Sarah, he replied, but as soon as the words left his mouth, he felt the weakness in his argument. He himself no longer fully believed in the so-called procedure. Sarah shook her head, folding a file neatly in front of her. That's not an excuse in this situation, especially when the victim is an innocent child. And worse, it's the daughter of Captain Williams. Procedure or not, your actions cross the line. And now we have to face a serious investigation. There's video evidence, there are witnesses. Everything is against you. John remained silent, Sarah's words making him feel as if everything was falling apart. He had known the situation would be serious, but he had not thought it would escalate this far. And this quickly. The police department was already a place full of pressure. But now, with this incident, John felt more isolated than ever. As he left the meeting room, John faced the cold stares of his colleagues. They no longer laughed or exchanged friendly words with him, as they used to. In fact, some even avoided him as he passed. Unwilling to face him, John clearly felt that he was becoming an outsider in his own organization. Meanwhile, David had begun meeting with lawyers and preparing for the long battle ahead. His anger was not just directed at John, but at the entire system that allowed such abuses of power to exist. For years he knew that this fight was not just about getting justice for Alyssa, but about protecting the rights of other children who may have suffered similar injustices, but had no one to stand up for them. David also understood that the police department would not easily accept defeat, especially since the investigation could negatively affect the department's image and reputation. But David was determined. the memory of Alyssa's terrified eyes when Rex pinned her down was still etched deeply in his mind. That made him even more resolute in pushing for the investigation and ensuring that John Miller would be held accountable for what he had done. The investigation became more complex as witnesses were called in to provide testimony. Many people in the park that day had recorded the incident on their phones, and these videos became powerful evidence against John. Pressure from the community continued to grow as social justice groups in the black community began organizing protests outside the police station, demanding justice for Alyssa and for John Miller to be held accountable. In his office, John Miller felt the growing weight of pressure bearing down on him. The whispers from his colleagues outside, the disdainful looks, and the feeling of isolation made him feel cornered. The internal affairs investigation was moving quickly, with the videos and witness testimonies piling up against him, and every passing second made him feel more and more like his career was on the brink of collapse, unable to sit idly by and wait for his fate to be decided. John knew he had to act. He left his office with a new resolve to find a way to protect himself at all costs. His mind raced with plans to get out of his current situation. He needed help, he needed someone on his side, and most of all, he needed to minimize the consequences of the incident. John headed to the office of Mark Stevenson, the head of the local police union. Mark had helped many officers in similar legal troubles before, though John was not entirely sure he would receive Mark's support. He knew this was his only chance to salvage his career. "Mark, I need to talk," John said as he entered the room. His voice urgent. Mark looked up at him, his sharp eyes assessing the situation. Before making a decision, John, "I've heard about it already," Mark said with a sigh, inviting John to sit down. "This is not just a small incident anymore. It's turning into a media firestorm. You made a big mistake by releasing the dog on a child, and it's even worse that it was the police captain's daughter," said. John hung his head, feeling the weight of the deadlock he was in. "I know, Mark, but I cannot let this go too far. I followed procedure, and I need to protect myself. There's got to be a way to handle this without ruining everything, right?" Mark was silent for a moment, considering John's words. "This has already gone too far. John, you're not just up against David Williams. You're up against the whole community in the system. But you still have a chance. If we can shift the investigation's focus," Mark said, his eyes growing sharper, "we can make this less serious by creating a valid reason for your actions. For example, you could say that you suspected the girl was doing something dangerous, or even blame it on a miscommunication with Rex, the dog." John was quiet for a moment, thinking about Mark's suggestion. Deep down he knew it was not true. Alyssa was completely innocent in just playing. But in this situation, John did not have many options. "So what can we do to lessen the consequences?" John asked, trying to hide the hesitation in his voice. Mark looked at John, his eyes full of calculation. "We need to make you look like the victim of a misunderstanding. I can arrange a press conference where you'll express remorse while stating that you had no intention of harming anyone. Will push the narrative that you were just following procedure and that the girl acted suspiciously. This might help calm the public reaction and reduce the pressure from the investigation." John felt like he was being dragged into a swamp. He knew that blaming Alyssa would only complicate the situation and could backfire. But at this point, with everything going against him, he did not have much of a choice. "All right," he said, his voice weak, "I'll go with your plan." The next day a press conference was held. John stepped up to the podium with a tired and heavy face. The camera flashes from the photographers went off repeatedly, and both the reporters and the public were watching closely. At the press conference, John stated that his actions were simply a misunderstanding, that Rex had reacted too quickly to the situation, and that he had no intention of harming little Alyssa. He tried to express remorse and hoped the investigation would proceed fairly. But soon after the press conference ended, the public's reaction was not as expected. David Williams, upon hearing about the press conference, was extremely furious. He saw it as a dishonest act and pointed out that John was trying to deflect blame instead of taking responsibility. "He's blaming my daughter, a 6-year-old child," David told the press later, his eyes filled with rage. He does not even have the courage to admit his mistake. David's outrage only fueled the public's anger. Social justice groups, who had been closely watching the case, began organizing larger protests outside the police station, demanding John's suspension in a fair investigation. Videos of the dog attacking Alyssa continue to be widely shared, and the media's criticism showed no signs of letting up. With the situation getting worse by the day, John began to realize that Mark's plan might not be as effective as he had hoped. Instead of calming things down, it seemed to be making everything worse. The internal affairs investigation was still ongoing, and with the growing amount of evidence from witnesses and videos, John could feel his future in the police force fading. Meanwhile, David was not giving up his fight. He and his lawyers continued gathering evidence, holding meetings with internal affairs, and publicly sharing the evidence in their favor, through the media, ensuring that John would not easily escape responsibility. When John Miller realized that all his efforts to defend himself were becoming futile, and the situation was only worsening, he began to feel even more isolated. The internal affairs investigation had not slowed down, and public outrage only intensified. After the failed press conference, David Williams and the social activist groups refused to back down. They were determined to demand a public investigation and justice for Alyssa. Pressure from the media, public anger, and criticism from his colleagues made John feel like everything was falling apart. But just when things seemed hopeless, John received help from an unexpected source. Michael Green, a former police officer and John's colleague. Before Michael left the force a few years ago, Michael and John were not close friends, but they had worked together long enough for Michael to understand John's nature, especially in tough situations. Michael knew the system and what was happening within the police department. Justice was not always served fairly. Michael arranged to meet John at a quiet cafe in the suburbs, far from the prying eyes of the media in the public. When John sat down across from Michael, his eyes were heavy with exhaustion and stress. He knew this meeting might be one of his last chances to find a solution, or at least to better understand the situation. "John, you're in big trouble," Michael began, not mincing words. He did not intend to make John feel better, but to make him see the gravity of the situation. This is not just between you and David Williams anymore. It's become a symbol of police abuse. And with the kind of public pressure we're seeing, the police department may not stand behind you. John lowered his head, unable to refute anything. He understood that Michael was right. Things had spiraled far out of his control. I do not know what to do anymore. Michael, John sighed. Everything I've tried has not worked. The public has turned against me. I was following procedure, but now no one cares about that. Michael looked at John. His eyes filled with careful consideration. I'm not here to justify your actions, John. You know you made a mistake, but I think I can help you get out of this situation, or at least lessen the consequences. John looked up at Michael with a glimmer of hope. How, he asked. There are a few officers in the department you could reach out to for help in providing favorable evidence for you. But not by blaming the girl, because that will only make things worse. Michael warned, you need to be honest. Admit that you acted rashly. At the same time, I've learned about certain incidents in David Williams's past that, if brought to light, could complicate things for him. John was slightly taken aback by that. What do you mean, what has David done? John asked, not fully understanding Michael's intent. David has not always been the perfect father or model police captain everyone sees. Michael explained, he's made a few mistakes in the past. Incidents that people have chosen to forget or cover up. Those mistakes could make people re-evaluate him, and that might ease the pressure on you. John thought about Michael's words. The temptation to use this information was strong. If he could undermine David's perfect image in the public eye, it might help him reduce the outrage directed at him. However, deep down, John knew that doing so might complicate things further, and there was no guarantee it would actually work. I do not know, Michael, John said, his voice filled with hesitation. If I bring up David's mistakes, this could get even worse. I'm not sure I want to bring him down to save myself. Michael nodded, understanding John's inner conflict. You're right, John. You need to think carefully before making that decision. You can choose the path of honesty, admit your mistake, and seek forgiveness from the community. Or you can use this information to protect yourself. But remember, every action has consequences. John sat in silence, thinking about everything Michael had said. He knew he was facing a difficult decision. If he admitted his mistake and was honest, he might lose everything: his career, his honor, and the life he had built. But if he used David's past mistakes to defend himself, he might save his career, but also destroy his relationships with his colleagues and his reputation in the community. The meeting with Michael had opened a new path for John, but it also made him realize that no choice was perfect. Whichever path he chose, he would have to face the consequences, and that made the storm he was facing seem more complicated and unpredictable than ever. As for David Williams, he was not slowing down in his preparations for the legal battle. David knew that John Miller might try anything to defend himself, but he was determined to protect his daughter and get justice for Alyssa. He was ready to face whatever came his way, even if John tried to bring up his past mistakes. To shift the focus, this battle, it was clear, would no longer be just between John and David, but withdraw in the entire system and the watchful eyes of the community. As the internal investigation neared its conclusion, John Miller and knew that there was not much time left to make his final decision. Michael Green's advice still echoed in his mind. Should he be honest and take responsibility, or should he use the damaging information about David Williams to save his career with each passing day? The pressure from the community, the protests, and even his colleagues only made John's situation more suffocating. Finally, the day of the hearing arrived. The atmosphere in the police station that day was tense and heavy. The crowd outside continued to gather, chanting for justice for Alyssa, and demanding that the police department take serious action. Social activist groups, parents, and even the media were all closely watching this event, as it had become more than just an internal hearing. It had become a symbol of the fight against police abuse. David Williams was present at the hearing, sitting in the front row with his lawyers. He sat up straight, his eyes cold and full of determination. Alyssa was not present. David did not want his daughter to endure any more trauma. He had prepared everything to push the case to its conclusion, to get justice for his daughter. John walked into the hearing room, unable to hide his nervousness. His eyes scanned the room, feeling the coldness in the stares of everyone around him. Across from him, Sarah Thompson, the head of the internal investigation, was ready to begin the hearing. "Let's begin," Sarah said, her voice sharp. "Officer John Miller, you are accused of excessive use of force by releasing a police dog to attack Alyssa Williams, a 6-year-old child, while there was no actual threat. This is your opportunity to present your side. Explain yourself and provide any evidence to defend yourself." John took a deep breath, feeling the weight of every word Sarah said. This was the critical moment. He had to decide whether to be honest and admit his mistake, or use what Michael had suggested. The anxiety surged, but John knew he could not back down. John stood up, looking directly at Sarah and the entire hearing panel. He began to speak, his voice shaky but trying to stay steady. "I want to start by saying that I had no intention of harming anyone, especially a child like Alyssa Williams. At the time, I believed I was doing my job correctly. But now, after looking back, I realized that my actions were a grave mistake." The room fell into a heavy silence. Everyone was listening intently, but no one dared to speak. John continued, "I misjudged the situation. The girl was not a threat. I acted without careful consideration and abused my power. I take full responsibility for my actions and apologize to the Williams family, especially Alyssa." Each word from John fell softly in the room, but it did not ease the tense atmosphere. David stared at John, his eyes unwavering. Though John had apologized, it did not erase the pain and fear his daughter had endured. Sarah was silent for a moment before she continued, "Officer Miller, your apology is noted, but we must also consider the evidence from the incident. Do you have any additional information or evidence to defend yourself against these charges?" John paused. This was the moment when he had to decide whether or not to use the information about David Williams's past. His hand unconsciously gripped the edge of the table, Michael's words echoing in his head. "Using that information could get you out of this." But when he looked at David's face, at the focused eyes of those around him, and thought about the consequences of pushing things further, John decided not to do it. He sighed and said, "No. I have no further evidence. I just want to admit my mistake and take responsibility for what I've done." Sarah stared at John, as if trying to assess the sincerity in his words. After a moment of silence, she signaled for the panel to begin their discussion. The discussion lasted only a few minutes, but to John it felt like an eternity. Sweat began to form on his brow, as all eyes in the room were on the panel. Finally, Sarah stood up and announced the decision. "After reviewing the evidence, witness testimonies, and your own admission, we conclude that your actions, Officer John Miller, violated proper procedure and were an abuse of power. Therefore, we have decided to strip you of your position in the police force, and the case will be referred to higher authorities." For further legal review, the room fell silent. John hung his head, feeling as if his entire world was collapsing before his eyes. He had lost everything: his position, his honor, and possibly his future in the police force. But deep down, he knew that this was the price he had to pay for the mistakes he had made. David sat quietly, his face emotionless. After all the struggles, the truth had been revealed, and justice had begun to be served. But in his heart, Alyssa's pain remained, and he knew it would take a long time to heal that wound. John stood up, walking out of the hearing room, feeling lost amidst the crowd. His career was over, and now he had to face an uncertain future. David watched John leave, and though he had won justice for his daughter, he did not feel victorious. This battle was only the beginning, and he knew that many systemic issues still needed to be addressed to prevent abuses of power in the future. David Williams sat in the hearing room, watching John Miller walk out the door. Though the decision had been made, and justice had been partially served, David did not feel the relief he had expected. This was not the victory he had hoped for, because nothing could erase the fear Alyssa had experienced. Justice, though established, still left David with a deep void and concerns about the larger issues within the system. As people began to leave the hearing room, David stayed a bit longer, sighing, reflecting on what had just happened. He had won recognition for the truth and protected his daughter, but deep down he knew that this was not just about John Miller being punished. It was about confronting a system with many flaws, where abuses of power, like John's, could happen easily and often go unchecked. David stood up and left the hearing room. Outside, the supporters of justice for Alyssa were still there, chanting slogans calling for change. As David walked through the crowd, many patted him on the shoulder, congratulating him and expressing their admiration. They saw him as a symbol of the fight against abuse of power, as a father who would not stand by when his daughter was treated unjustly. But David knew that justice for Alyssa was just the first step in a long journey to change the entire system. When he got home, Alyssa was sitting on the couch, holding her favorite stuffed animal. Seeing her father walk in, she immediately ran to him. Hugging him tightly, David knelt down, holding his daughter close, feeling her little heart still trembling from the earlier trauma. "Are you okay, Alyssa?" David asked softly, stroking her hair. Alyssa nodded, her eyes sparkling as she looked up at her father. "I'm okay, Daddy. I'm not scared anymore." But in her voice, David could still hear a hint of fragility. Easily hurt, he knew that emotional wounds would not heal quickly. But what mattered was that Alyssa felt safe with him, and that brought David comfort. Angela, David's wife, came over, her eyes also filled with concern. "Is it over?" she asked, her voice soft but filled with anxiety. "It's partly over," David replied, pulling Alyssa closer. "John's been stripped of his rank, and the investigation will continue. But I do not think this is the real end. There's still a lot that needs to change." Angela nodded, understanding her husband's feelings. "I just hope the little one can get over her fear soon. What happened was too much for a child like Alyssa." David held his daughter tighter, his eyes looking out the window. "We'll get through it together, I promise, and not just for Alyssa. I'll keep fighting, so that no other child has to go through this again." In the days that followed, the Williams family slowly returned to their normal lives. Alyssa started playing again, though there were still moments when she would flinch at the sound of a dog barking in the distance. David knew that his daughter's recovery would take time, but he also believed that they were on the right path. With each step Alyssa took, he could see the strength and resilience in her, and that made him prouder than ever. David's work at the police station continued, but things were no longer the same. The recent events had left a deep mark on the department. Discussions about abuse of power and the responsibility of the police force had become more open and serious. Everyone knew that misconduct of John Miller's could no longer be overlooked. David knew that he had sparked a change, even if it was small, but it was a step in the right direction. One afternoon, David took Alyssa to the park, where the incident first happened. The gentle breeze blew through, sunlight filtering through the leaves, and the laughter of children echoed in the air. Alyssa stopped at the top of a small hill, looking down at the grassy area, where she had been attacked by Rex. David watched his daughter, worried that the bad memories would scare her, but instead of fear, Alyssa smiled, gently turning around and running down the hill with a joyful laugh. She had overcome her fear, and now the park was no longer a place of pain, but had returned to being a place of play and happiness. David stood watching his daughter run and play, feeling lighter than ever before. He knew the fight was not over, but at least he had regained peace for his family. And as he watched Alyssa's radiant smile, he understood that this was the most important victory in his life, the journey to get justice for Alyssa and other children like her proved that the power of courage and perseverance could change not just an individual, but an entire community. David Williams fought not just for his daughter, but for all those without a voice, ensuring that no one would suffer injustice because of their skin color, age, or social status. This story reminds us that justice does not come from empty promises, but from tireless struggle, from love and responsibility. Through this story, we see the power of a father's love, the courage to stand up for what's right, and the importance of transparency. In the justice system, Alyssa overcame her fear, and David not only protected his daughter, but also the future of many other children. If you found inspiration in this story's meaningful messages, hit the subscribe button so you do not miss out on more stories about courage, justice, and the power of love. Each story is a lesson, a source of inspiration for us to build a better world together. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next videos.